What is your culture? Yeah.
Collectivism would be pretty much the summary of it all,
Okay, collectivism, what sense?
compared to the individualistic lifestyle that a lot of the North American nations have. My culture would have a lifestyle where everyone, even the extended family members, know what's going on in my life, or I know what's going on in their life.
Okay, social norms, expectations, communications, what else? Yeah?
We talked about the difference in culture just even in Canada, like from the west coast to northern BC, and the slight differences there in maybe the way we communicate with each other or out in public. I notice in cities, you don't really talk to people, you just go where you need to go, and I'm used to kind of, oh hey, how's it going?
Variations in geographical location. What else? Yep.
We also talked about small towns, but also growing up in the north, so lots of things with snow from Montreal, some of those traditions we did in elementary school.
Okay, good. So this will give us some features of culture. The first thing, it is learned, not something you are born with. Are there things purely instinctual in human beings? Yes.
Drive for food, I think.
Even then, breastfeeding a child, you would think the one instinctual thing it should know is how to latch on. In reality, you need guidance. The mother and child need guidance to know how to feed the child. So in certain ways, even the fundamental thing in our life, the ability to get food those first few days and weeks, is not strongly controlled by instinct. It has to be learned. The person feeding the child must learn how to feed the child properly so the child can get the nutrition. Defecation, urination, the need to eat. These are things we must do to maintain ourselves. They are shaped by culture. We learn how to do these things that are part of the natural biological process in certain ways, fulfilling our biological need, but at the same time, we're still being shaped culturally by what is acceptable. What would be your reaction if all of a sudden McDonald's decides we're going to add maggot burgers to our menu? What would be your gut reaction?
Disgusting.
Exactly. Why do we feel disgust with maggots? Yes.
It's also learned what we eat and why it's learned culturally. So
We associate maggots with death, rotting meat, what is corrupt, rotten. Technically speaking, from a purely biological perspective, if you take the protein, it might actually be more efficient than other forms of protein. We are not likely to see maggot burgers on the menu of McDonald's anytime soon because of the larger cultural meanings, expectations, and the value system. In a sense, what does eating tell us about who we are as individuals? Even the biological realm is mediated by culture. We still have to find out how it is done. Culture mediates natural, the physical. Culture is shared. Because imagine what life would be like if you didn't share certain expectations. And I think you were mentioning the differences between even different, I guess, of British Columbia. Simple things. Walking down the hallway, sees an acquaintance. What are you likely to do?
Say hi, wave.
What do they expect?
Hi and wave back.
Exactly. And nobody is expecting that you will stop them and talk for them for 10 minutes. It is one of those, the expectations. Certain ways it's shared. In the sense, I know what is expected of me, what is expected of you. We will go through the performance of doing what is expected at that given time. This comes back to what we're discussing with culture shock. What happens when all of a sudden everything that you had thought was shared in our expectations is no longer there? What happens when all the things you take for granted are no longer relevant? Yeah? Lost and stressful. So if I put my hand out to shake and they slap me to the side of the head, I'll say, oh, that is odd. And if all of a sudden next time I do it, they'll lose something else. It is that we having the stress of never knowing how the other person is going to react is quite a stressful thing, because when we grow up, when we learn a culture, when we are culturated within a certain society, we have expectations that tell us it's not stressful because I would know how that other person should react and how I should act to get that. When that is thrown out the window, it becomes difficult to navigate. Having things that are learned but also shared between individuals is a hallmark of culture. It tends to be symbolic. All human societies are complex in the information we share, whether it is our belief systems, whether it is the knowledge that we acquire, how to process certain foods to eat them. So it requires highly symbolic communication to share effectively from one generation to the next. Even if they reach the stage when they're 5, when they can more or less survive, that child, without the knowledge acquired from their community, will die within hours or days. We learn what we need to survive. Culture tends to be adaptive, though sometimes it is maladaptive. And if we ask the question, why do you think that humans would decide to do certain things which would be maladaptive?
Sometimes they were helpful in past contexts, but circumstances change and they become really, really unhelpful.
Exactly. So what was perhaps adaptive at point X may prove maladaptive. We see societies occasionally collapse. Certain societies develop a culture to live a certain way. If the environment or social realm no longer allows these adaptations, your society will be at risk. There are cases where we think it is useful in the short run, but will it hurt us in the long run? Will those changes require new adaptations to ensure we can continue that we can survive? So even if we look at our society, is, let's say, Western industrial or neo-industrial society, are we well adapted or maladapted?
Well adapted for the most part, but there are parts that could be worked on.
What are some of the parts that could be worked on? Yeah?
I think we're very individualistic. Our cities are spread out. It's not good for communication and community.
Especially North American cities, in Europe and elsewhere might be different. So the question is, and these bring, again, it comes back to the idea of culture being holistic, in that very often certain aspects of what of culture and certain aspects in a sense will have changes elsewhere. So let's say city planning. In France, in the 1840s, people barricaded the narrow streets in Paris. It was difficult for thus the government to send in the troops to clear them out. Finally, once this uprising was put down, they changed the layout. They decided we will get rid of the small streets, put in wide avenues. In the center, avenues will radiate outwards. But then, all of a sudden, this has an impact. So thus, if you think about it, what is the advantage of having small, very curvy roads when it comes to transportation? Yep.
Cars go slower, less risk of hitting people.
The slow, windy roads force people, whether it is a horse-drawn carriage or a car, you have to go slower because it's physically won't be possible. And if all of a sudden it's so narrow that you come across somebody else, both of you have to push to the sides extremely to pass each other, which means traffic will be slow. But who are the people you would expect that might be in danger of being run over in a street if they were playing? Exactly. So all of a sudden the children, then all of a sudden if you have the nice wide, avenues, traffic speed increases, much more dangerous for the children, then it is, what do you do then? What might be required? Playground zones, what else?
Keeping kids indoors or fenced behind places where they can't run out onto the street.
Exactly. And what would that require in terms of social changes?
Parents have to spend more time directly watching their kids.
Somebody has to spend more time watching the children. You have to find somebody. They may not be able to work or be involved in business. Who will do it? How will you organize the time? You're changing the kinship structure, changing the family structures. You're changing these ways where people live their day-to-day lives with unexpected consequence. But also the other goal of the avenues, you have these stores, these storefronts with windows, in a sense, selling their goods. So you're also, all of a sudden, will promote a very capitalist worldview. You have something to strive for in what you want to buy. And very often, the very first department stores were modeling what a middle class should be all about, how you should, in a sense, be, what should be in your kitchen, living room, bedroom. It was the equivalent of the TikTok influencer. We have TikTok influencers saying, look, this is how you might want to live the good life. Then it was the department store saying, this is how you can imagine the good life to be, which again has impacts, work dynamics, kinship dynamics, economics, etc. Culture is shared, learned, symbolic. Culture is, again, it's holistic. One part will have an impact of the other. Culture is tied to biological processes. Culture can change. So your culture is maladaptive. you can come up with ways of trying to figure out, can we make things better? So in other words, we can look at the use of fossil fuels in our society and global warming, etc. So what are we, in a sense, how is our culture trying to adapt to that?
Can you rephrase the question?
For example, one of the threats, in a sense, we might say the Industrial Revolution, the burning of coal and fossil fuels led to what is, I guess, happening with global warming. So that was, in certain ways, we can see that was maladaptive in the long run. But how can culture change to deal with it?
Culture can grow more sustainable by adapting practices of sustainability.
Carpooling is becoming more common, and public transportation systems are heavily wanted. Building more infrastructure for electric vehicles.
From the anthropological perspective, what is the challenge of convincing people to take the bus? Interacting with the public? Let's say yes.
They can't necessarily get where they want to go.
An inconvenience. But also, who would be the highest ranked person? One of the higher ranked officials can afford to be on the bus.
Probably not.
And why? Interacting with the public.
It might feel a status thing. Rich would be driving a fancy car. They wouldn't be on the bus. You're on the bus. You exceed.
Class, social class, yes.
Could have to do with security. I get stopped on the bus.
The challenge is the class structure, and you're right. If I am a multimillionaire living in Prince George, the expectation is I'll have the biggest pickup truck of them all. But also there is the other cultural aspect, and this is very true for American society, but also by extension Canadian society, the idea of independence. As we mentioning timings we have in North American society, and especially was put forward by the American culture that seeped and interacted with in Canada, the idea that having a vehicle defines me, not only in terms of class, but shows I am free and independent. I'm not constrained by other issues. Trying to get people to do what is positive, what is adaptive and well adapted to our challenges may face constraints on our symbolic understanding and construction of society. No, I can't go with those poor people on the bus. Expensive electric cars. I'll drive my expensive Tesla. You have to come up with change while dealing with cultural narratives that are difficult to change in the short run. These are things that might take generations to change. When looking at culture, we have to assume that it's not always adaptive. You're still being influenced by larger narratives, ideologies that cross generations. When we look from the anthropological perspective, it can be the evolution of species, the primate species, how we came to be Homo sapiens sapiens, but also evolutionary of the culture in says that culture changes. But what is important to remember that in all types of evolution, there is no ladder and end goal. So in other words, biological evolution, there was no, evolution is leading to this. No, it was the random events over times with natural selection that led to certain species, I guess, thriving, certain disappearing, certain remaining unchanged for tens or hundreds of millions of years. End run. Dealing with environmental pressures or changes in niches, there is no perfect form of evolution. So the cockroach is as evolved as the dog, as me, in the sense that they all are the process of a long evolutionary process. The same with culture. Culture changes, but it doesn't mean one culture has reached the apex. It's recognizing change, and often these changes were shaped by the larger forces, whether it's environmental, whether it's forces dealing with the larger world, world around us. Having to adapt very often for your both individual survival, but also your community, your social survival. Now, we will discuss the subfields of anthropology. Anthropologists study humanity past, present, the cultural as well as the biological, and how, in a sense, I guess this is intertwined. So the first part is biological. Studying humans as biological organisms, our physical makeup, and this can be in terms of our body structures. DNA increasingly is being used. So trying to understand this must be understood within our larger, from both the species perspective, but the individual perspective, and how things may have changed. So here you have different elements. Biological anthropology will include primatology. Primatology will be looking at the order of primates, and very often will specialize on different, I guess, perhaps on one particular species. So whether it is a chimpanzee, whether it is various types of monkeys, the primatologist is primarily concerned with the study of our most closest biologically related species within the primate order. The study in primatology can be used to figure out things such as how did speciation occur over tens of millions of years? Looking at the evolution of primate species, including our genus Homo, how can the study of other primates help us understand how we got to be where we are in terms of other species?
While looking at the differences of our closest relatives.
Exactly. So looking at how things are done. So the simple things such as chimpanzees and gorillas and the eating of meat and hunting and how their social organizations. So sometimes females are dominant, sometimes very male-led organizations. Chimpanzees tend to be related males, usually siblings, the brothers that are leader of the group. So you have trying to understand how these different species in the primates, how they have adapted, how they have evolved, how they structure their own social dynamics. Because apart from perhaps the lemurs and the lorises tend to be social beings. They live in groups. They are tied with social interactions. Very often look at these species, answer questions. We might look at the most closely related species to us that are still existing today would be the chimpanzee. And you have the two types. You have the larger chimpanzee, but you also have, the much smaller, the bonobo. And very often we can say, what can we learn from these? And assuming that, let's say, perhaps the chimpanzees, the bonobos, and our Homo genus had at some point some kind of shared ancestor. How would this have affected the evolution of our direct ancestral line? We see differences. Chimpanzees tend to be much more patriarchal kind of organization, but the bonobos, it's all about the sex. It is what is quite interesting, since with the bonobos, the women, the females have, in a sense, much more active role. Sex will happen often. It is a useful mechanism of social cohesion. Individuals will be interacting with each other. The questions will be, so what did we come out, was our first ancestors were more of a chimpanzee-like social structure or more bonobo? Or what are the ways, in the sense that this would have impacted the evolution of these first, these first ancestors to eventually what would become Homo sapien. The way they eat meat, share meat, this meat can impact their diet. There are things that are studying species X of the primate order, but nonetheless, there's still in anthropology the idea of comparative, the ability to compare not different species, different societies, different cultures, different individuals, to see what is common. What do the differences tell us about, these different ways of being? What are the impacts of these differences on these organisms, on these beings, biological beings, but also their social interactions? All these subfields will be looking at the comparative, trying to understand how what I am studying be compared to other phenomena. How can these phenomena be used to understand what I am studying? How can I create, through comparison or analogy, how I can use other information to better understand the problem I am examining? You have then, so once you've reached out to primatologists and the paleoanthropologists looking at the evolution of these species, including those that led to Homo sapiens, you have those biological anthropologists focusing on contemporary humans and their lives, biological and otherwise. The difference perhaps will be comparing, let's say, the biological anthropologist with perhaps more of the biomedical approach, is that the biological anthropology will be looking at things as society and culture impact our physical well-being, our health and illness, and the survival of our species and our subspecies, but how we can actually change things. Because we do know, and again, when it coming down, to looking at, the biological, how can things such as eliminating certain bodily wastes, in a sense, be tied to issues of health? Diseases spread by exposure to fecal matter or other human excretions. So in other words, the cholera bacteria does not care, how it's transmitted. It's only from its evolutionary perspective, just as long as it's transmitted from host A to host B, it's successful if transmitted. But certain factors will either encourage or discourage the transmission of that particular pathogen. So that's the biological anthropologist will be looking at What are the ways, in a sense, that human behaviors, human culture, the way that we do things, how could it be encouraging or discouraging the spread of pathogens, whether bacteria, viruses, or parasites? So you're trying to understand the impact. And the bigger perspective as well is that how do humans, how over the millennia have adapted to certain conditions? How many here can drink a glass of milk and not feel any repercussions? How many would feel it for a few hours afterwards? So if you think, what we can say, so if you look at and why is it in the sense that some individuals drink milk and some can't?
Genetics.
What is the main sugar in milk? Humans, while breastfeeding, can digest milk because human milk, in a sense, is mammal milk, so will include some lactose as well. But most humans throughout history have lost the ability, once they were past the breastfeeding age, to be able to digest lactose. So but there tends to be some conditions. Where will you likely find populations capable of digesting lactose? Yeah. But more specifically, in Europe and regions of Africa, people who had cattle, sheep, goats, milking them, and this wouldn't have happened automatically overnight. But very often when it comes to evolution, biological evolution, we have bottlenecks. When 90 to 95% of the population will be wiped out. These bottlenecks, the genetic mutation that allows better survival, that 5% will reproduce and return to the population level before. So let's say you have 1,000 individuals, they come down to 50. After a few generations, they'll be back to 1,000. What can I expect of the genetic DNA of that 1,000 after the bottleneck? This can be significant because if there's a drought and I still have my milk, but I can't digest the milk, I'm more likely to die. If I have the ability to drink milk during this period where at least I have some milk to help me survive the starvation, what happens if those individuals who have the ability to digest the lactose, they are most of the 50 that survive?
That trait will pass on to the kids as well.
Exactly. So the 1,000 that will come back after multiple generations, most will be able to digest milk. This not only applies to human evolution, but evolutions to various species over time, is that all of a sudden, if you have something happens very drastic that will cut down the populations, if those survivors had something that allowed them to survive this bottleneck, their genes will be the ones who will be passed on to the successive generation. And this over time, of course, can bring about changes such as, can you drink milk or do you not drink milk? So those where you find, generally speaking, the ability of the lactase when you're an adult would be in populations that had the cattle. So whether it's parts of Europe, Western Asia, various parts of Africa as well, where you have cattle, these are places where I'd be more likely to encounter populations that will have the ability to digest milk readily, because if they had at some point had this bottleneck that would favor those individuals who had the ability to digest milk. So that's what we said. So biological anthropology will be looking at what are the factors that certain of these differences that can be seen biologically. Because most of our adaptation is cultural. So if I'm going to live in the Arctic, over many generations, the population might have slighter fingers and other slight modifications. Generally speaking, 95 to 99% of what allows you to survive in the cold will be clothing, types of clothing, the ability to process the hides, sew them together, maintain them supple. There's the social cultural changes that allow you to adapt to live in a certain climate, but there's still at times different pressures that will encourage certain adaptation. This is what biological anthropology will look at. Here's another aspect. How about sickle cell anemia? Are you familiar with this? What is sickle cell anemia?
When red blood cells have or a crescent
Shape. The problem with having sickle cells as your blood cells.
because then the transportation of oxygen is not as much as a regular red blood.
Exactly. So thus, and this is based, I guess, whether you have the crescent-shaped blood cell or the round one, is based on one gene. All humans have two sets of chromosomes. If in chromosomes you have both genes for sickle cell anemia, you largely have only sickle cell. And then, of course, your body won't be able to transport the oxygen. It will have severe consequences on the biology of that individual. They may not survive. They may not have children. So thus, those individuals with both of the sickle cells are less likely to survive. From an evolutionary perspective, what would that lead to?
Probably like sickle cell anemia?
Yeah.
Death, I think.
Death. And if you have individuals who have both of the genes are dying, what will I expect?
The gene will disappear.
Over time, the gene will disappear. Why maintain itself?
Sickle cell anemia stops you from getting
Malaria. The individual less likely to come down with sickle cell anemia will be the individual with the one gene of each. One sickle cell variation of the gene, one of the alleles, and having one without. So that individual will thus have blood capable of carrying oxygen, but enough sickle cells to have a lower chance of coming down with, with a malaria. So the individual who has both will not face the extreme consequence of having both genes, less chance to come down with malaria. And the individuals with both, that doesn't have any in both sets, both genes in the chromosomes, if they have both non-sickle cell, they're the ones who are most likely to come down with malaria and potentially most likely to die or not have, offspring. So therefore, what you're doing in terms of the selection, because of, you have thus the ones who are, the homozygous, the ones who have both genes for sickle cell or both genes for non-sickle cells are ones more likely to not survive and have children. So ones having children over time will continue having children who have both. It creates the equilibrium because this type is favorable for our place to survive. This will continue repeating. But if all of a sudden in a population, in a region, you drain the swamps and you get rid of the mosquitoes. Exactly. And over time, what will this mean?
sickle cell anemia will die out. It will
Ex-
become more common.
And we've seen this happen elsewhere. So, for example, now even though sickle cells associated with certain regions of Africa, in the past there was sickle cell anemia in places such as southern Spain or southern Italy, where there used to be these marshes, where you used to have malaria, where you used to have sickle cell. But once all of a sudden, when you had these projects to the draining, when the malaria disappeared, then over time, and this was in a sense pre-modern, more biomedical approach, this condition disappeared over time because of the change in select depression. Biological anthropologists will often look at the forces that shape certain populations within the species. Within our common shared, Homo sapiens. Local populations over generations may adapt. So this is what biological culture will be looking at. So how do these changes affect the existing population? How are these populations the product of evolutionary changes? With global movement across continents, what is the new problem that all of a sudden is faced? If you are the very pale Norwegian family that immigrated to Australia, what will be the problem? Sunburn, more likely to have skin cancer. What was well adapted for Norway, where you needed to produce your vitamin D, all of a sudden, you're now faced with having too much exposure that will lead to other consequences. So now what we are seeing is globally populations move, evolutionary natural selection forces push towards certain features. When you move, that is no longer the case. In other cases, somebody came from a region where they developed very dark melanin to protect against the UV radiation. If they move to Prince George, they will face exactly. So for the very pale descendant of Norwegians in Australia, you better lather up with a sunscreen. And if you have from regions with high concentrations of melanin, there won't be enough sunlight to produce the vitamin D, you better take this vitamin D supplement. Cultures come up with ways to address previous adaptations of certain populations in order to address now the new challenges that are, in a sense, that are being met. And sometimes even we see old diseases come back up, such as scurvy. So every so often, somebody who might be relying too much on ramen and only ramen may all of a sudden develop scurvy if not eating any fruit or vegetables, getting vitamin C, because there too, humans, we're one of the few species, we can't produce our own vitamin D and we can't produce our own vitamin C. And I was reading one article that tried to explain why is it that even other primates are capable of developing, I guess, the vitamin C, and humans can. And the one thing which was put forward was that not being able to produce vitamin C actually saves you or protects from certain parasites. So in other words, if I'm a human over many millennia, even longer, all of a sudden we stop producing vitamin C because that gave me competitive biological advantage because it meant that I might be less likely to die or to feel the consequences of parasites. It was a good thing. This trait was passed on. But if you don't have enough vitamin C in your diet, then you'll come up with a horrible condition of scurvy where you'll start, instead of blistering, losing teeth. So that's again, so it was one of those adaptations which was good. But if all of a sudden you no longer have the vitamin C, you might say, it's too bad I can't produce it on my own. But if you are not getting enough vitamin C from your food, what should you do?
Sorry.
So if you're not getting enough vitamin D or vitamin C in your diet, what are the cultural adaptations that will meet your needs? What the British did, bring lemons or apples or some kind of fruit that won't rot very quickly, so at least you'll get some vitamin C from your food. Or you can nowadays you have the vitamin pills, so you might not be able to digest it as effectively, but it'll do the job. If I were an Inuit living in the high Arctic, where there wasn't much in the way of vitamin D from fruit or vegetables or vitamin C pills, what is a cultural adaptation to get vitamin C?
It would be the livers of animals, and so by eating that, we can get them.
It has to be raw. Eat the raw liver of seals. Seals, like most species, produce their own vitamin C, so therefore, if I was the Inuit that live in the high Arctic, I'm not getting many fruit and vegetables, but if I eat the raw seal liver, I will get vitamin C. I can't cook it because that will break down the vitamin C. It's one of these cultural adaptations. You didn't need to evolve the ability to produce vitamin C in your gut. You found another way to get it within your environment using very cultural, social cultural knowledge in order to make sure that you didn't end up with scurvy if you were the Inuit eating traditional foods. So we still have biological evolution in terms of natural selection, the population pressures, but very often societies will find ways of addressing it without having to go through a bottleneck to then come up with a mutation that will allow us to survive. So that's, you have, and even simple things with medical anthropology. So it can also have a very strong social complex. So in our society, if I'm sick, what do I do?
Stay home.
But if I'm really sick?
Don't get in contact with other people, I guess. If it's convenient.
Yeah. Okay, go to hospital or the walk-in clinic. So let's say I'm walking into the walk-in clinic. What do I need to do to get the best outcome possible?
First.
It's true, well, the triage, but more specifically, how does our system work when seeing that doctor, whether in the hospital or walk-in clinic? What are they looking for? Once they are paid to deal with one issue, to come up with a diagnosis. How do they come up with a diagnosis? Yeah? If you want to get a service, you have to be very specific in your description of symptoms. Not just my head hurts. I say, I have a headache that starts usually after I eat. It'll start in my right side of the lobe. It'll spread across to the other side, and I'll feel it in the back of my head. And this will last 2 hours before. In other words, and before then, and this seems to happen, and then they might have follow-up questions. So what do you tend to eat before you get these headaches? They're trying to come to a diagnosis as soon as possible. The best way is to be clear in your symptoms, very specific, very precise. Then they use that to come up with a diagnosis. What do they do if they come up with a diagnosis? The prognosis, and then the outcomes. They'll say, we want to check it, give a blood sample, whatever sample may need, to the laboratory, then come back once we get the results. Or they might say, it's clear you have X, Y, or Z, and here is some medication that you may need. Or they might say, it's not uncomfortable, but it's not going to cause any long-term harm. All you have to do is go home, rest for a week, and you'll be better. But if it gets worse, then comes back. So these are, in a sense, what you're aiming. But medical anthropology will look at what happens if you don't share this same approach to diagnosis. If you have to talk a lot more, if your expectation of the doctor will listen to you a lot longer and you'll be providing much more information. And this is where you can have either social miscommunication, cultural miscommunication, where all of a sudden, if the game isn't understood and played the same way by both sides, you may not get the outcome you want. The biological anthropologist will be trying to understand within the medical system, how is the social and the cultural affecting the health outcomes of individuals. Here we are focusing on social culture anthropology. The social is the British approach, cultural, the Americans, Canadians being stuck between, we call it social cultural. This is the traditional expectations, how you would understand, learn about other cultures, go there, live with them, participate, observe. The goal being participant observation, so the methods you participate, you observe, but eventually you need material for analysis, and material for analysis will be your field notes. You write down, and the expectation was you would stay at least a year. Why do you think you would stay a year?
How they react to all the seasons and stuff, so like in some seasons they'll have like more ceremonies or like feasts, while in other seasons it's more work.
Exactly. You want to go through an annual cycle. The expectation is, if I stay a year, I will cover the main holidays. I'll see the main economic activities. I'm likely to see weddings, funerals, or important social activities. If you spend long enough, you'll get a better understanding. The goal is for you to understand that society, to write the ethnography. The graph is the writing of the ethnos. In Greek was what we'd say called today the ethnic group, or the nation, or the population. You're trying to come up with a detailed description of the population. Who are you writing it for?
People not in that culture.
If you are writing an ethnography of the Nuer, I guess in the Sudan, you won't, it's not necessarily directly aimed at the Nuer, but rather for people who are not of the society to understand that, I guess, that society. In European anthropology, European research, you have the ethnography, but the ethnography would lead to the ability to have the ethnology, the study of culture, using various ethnographies to come up with larger and larger understanding. So perhaps the ideal saying, are there certain things that shape all human societies? So we see this in, for example, Levi-Strauss, in the sense when he was trying to come up with his theories, the analysis of rituals, or the dichotomy, he said it doesn't really matter, I guess, which ones I use. If I have enough ethnography compared, eventually larger theories and laws governing those societies. Ethnology would be comparative to come up with saying maybe there are certain universals. But are there really any universals in human society? How about incest? All societies have some form of incest rules. Who you cannot marry, who you not have sex with. But what every society will have different rules as to which relationships are considered incestuous. You'll say, yes, we all have these rules, but what is incestuous for one society may be acceptable to another. Can you marry your cousin?
South Asian, particularly from a Muslim majority country, would more likely say yes.
Exactly. The advantage of marrying a cousin from an anthropological perspective.
Stays within the family.
Exactly. Because when it comes to kinship, is that when you marry, if you're marrying always outside of your group, let's say if you have some land or wealth, that means whatever you're inheriting will be split over time. It creates more allies. People you can call marrying cousins keeps descendants limited.
Someone from Alabama said, why go across town when you can go across the hall? Incest marriages.
True. But if marriages that are too incestuous, what is very often the outcome?
Problematic kids.
Yeah.
I was going to put it like that, but yeah.
Yeah.
I framed it.
Say, go look at paintings of the last Habsburg monarch. Because of incest over generations, he couldn't talk, he could barely eat. By the end, he wiped out the dynasty. The accumulation of genetic conditions might cause serious problems, I guess, in any given population. So again, it comes down to how does culture navigate, manage, come up with these rules. So even when something is universal, the application and exceptions vary from society to society and even over generations. So what was acceptable 10 generations past may all of a sudden change and become acceptable now. What you were trying to understand was the idea that falls into logic, and then come back holistic. So when we were saying, in a sense, the choice of when marriage would be incestuous, has any impact on division of wealth and capital over the generations. So that's, again, one thing is tied into the other, and that might be tied into issues of health. If you have, in a sense, I guess, some genetic conditions that will accumulate over time, that will leave individuals who will be so severely impacted by those health conditions that it's very difficult for them to live within their society. Each thing has an impact on something else. So why will they pursue this even if they start figuring out these negative consequences? Yes, we're seeing genetic anomalies, but why would society still continue?
The first argument could be that the benefits outweigh the consequences. The second argument could be that there's no reality to the issues for the kids.
Social pressures.
It comes back to the adaptive and the maladaptive. Maladaptive practices maintain themselves because of larger social narratives, larger social ideologies, ideas of the pure and the impure, the clean and the unclean. So very often we'll say, and very often you may not be making the links. You may be saying, this is the consequences not because of the intermarriage of close relatives, it's because of something else. So again, how do you come up with your diagnosis? Different societies will come up with different understandings of what might be causing a certain condition. We have to look at it from the bigger perspective. What forces encourage or hinder cultural practices or the events? But change is always possible. Change is possible, but very often it has to be understood within the larger context, and the most effective change comes from within the society. So if somebody is on the outside saying, no, you will change this, you'll meet much more resistance. To have really effective cultural change from within, it has to be actors very within that society that understand the society. They'll find ways of bringing about change that will hopefully benefit the larger society. So there are many different examples that we'll certainly look over the time. But there's also, in a sense, the other aspect of, again, one of the larger forces that shaped our planet over the last century or last few centuries is colonialism. The creation of colonies had impacts in terms of population distribution, economics, and accumulation in certain regions, the ways in which, even we see now the consequences, how sometimes borders were artificially drawn, and this can lead to conflict within, I guess, the nation states that emerged out of, I guess, the post-colonial era. So very often, yes, perhaps in decolonizing anthropology is to say we can't ignore, I guess, this impact of colonization or imperialism and understand. We have to say, how does it, in a sense, how can we fight it? How can we counter it? How can we counter the consequences of these past actions, these past politics, these past colonial activities? So again, with, I guess, the decolonized anthropology, very often, I guess, dealing, so in Canadian, North American context, might be dealing, let's say, with First Nations, Inuit, Métis, or other populations that are marginalized. How do you address history using anthropology to challenge the status quo? So that brings me to anthropological linguistics. So anthropological linguistics generally tends to have, in a sense, I guess, two different components. One is the analysis of the language itself. All languages have significant, meaningful sounds that are then used as the building block for that language. So thus, you have, in a sense, I guess, you have, for example, in English, sound k and n. So you have, in a sense, these sounds exist. But rules that change over time. For example, why do we spell knife as K-N-I-F-E? Yeah? It used to be pronounced knife. It wasn't a change in the phoneme, but in the phonology, the rules of the phoneme. At some point in the last few centuries, the phonology said, no, the K and N sound together is no longer acceptable. It's no longer a knife. But why did they keep the spelling? Easier.
Most people could write and didn't know the K made a K sound.
Yes. Inertia. At some point, if you're used to writing knife, societies can be very conservative. They don't want change. In the French language, there is a debate. Do you put l'accent circumflex, little hat on certain words, or not? It's probably still being determined. Do you need, I guess, this accent over the word hôpital? And the reason why you have this accent circonflexe, a bit of French, is because at some time there was an S. When this S was deleted, the vowel that came before it, all of a sudden you added the accent to indicate there used to be an S. In French is identical to hospital in English. The English kept the S, and in French they put the accent over it. And I have to double check to see in France where they got rid of the accent on hôpital. We can't underestimate the force of tradition and the need to be conservative, especially with, we always have the grammar Nazis among us who say, no, this is the right way that they is to write it. Those parts of the language, in the sense of trying to study anthropology, is looking at different languages, different rules when it comes to the use of these phonemes, the different rules of how you link these phonemes to make units of meaning, morphemes, and the syntax. How do you create meaning once you have all these together? It's more this aspect of linguistic anthropology that will look at different languages and try to figure out what are the underlying rules, structures of language. Sometimes anthropologists who have this expertise will be quite active in trying to maintain languages. So very often if you look at Indigenous First Nations languages in British Columbia, they're threatened or close to extinction because their native speakers might be in their 80s. And so there's a challenge of, can we try to record as much as we can, to try to write it down, to try to analyze it, write it down, come up with a record of these languages, lest they disappear if the last speakers pass away. In one case, when I was doing my master's, the chair of my master's committee in Quebec worked with the Huron in Quebec City to bring back a dead language. The last native speaker died in the 19th century, but he looked at historical documents. He looked at remnants of the recorded language in the 1930s by relatives who had ended up in Oklahoma, and using these traits, records, etc., was able to at least come back with enough of a basic language that they could teach people, the teachers who would then teach the children. So the expectation is not that everybody will all of a sudden be only speaking in the Wendat language, but enough will be brought back so you can apply it to the various principles. Finally, you have, in a sense, I guess, how language is actually used in day-to-day life. Differences between class. Upper, lower, middle classes speak differently. Gender. Will males or females or other genders within a given society, will there be different expectations when it comes to the use of the language and how they use the language? They may be using the same words, but if they use the same words differently, that is essential to try to understand, are there in the fact that they use these same words but differently based on context, will this have an impact on, what does this indicate about gender within a particular society or about class in the society? So Gen A or whatever is saying, this is how they talk, and here are the new words they're inventing. So you have differences within subgroups in how they use language. This is another important part of linguistic anthropology. I skipped over archaeology. Archaeology is trying to understand past cultures based on what they left behind. Usually garbage. If it's not garbage, it's still in use, and nobody wants an anthropologist to come do an excavation in their living room to go through whatever the furniture that they may have. So that's, at some point, archaeology is usually trying to reconstruct past society, cultures, etc., based on what was left behind. And what is left behind might be artifacts, tools, or other instruments that were fabricated. What is left behind might be things such as other forms of garbage, animal bones, fish bones, occasionally maybe other that they didn't necessarily leave behind, I guess, because they want to, but it was for nature, such as pollen, so that could be analyzed. Or it could be even traces such as if you drive a post into the ground, that post eventually will rot and will no longer be wood, but it will leave a discoloration in the ground, can be identified. What is important in archaeology matters is not the artifact or the eco-fact, but it is the context. So within the site, between sites, you're trying to come up with an analysis of what was happening. With new developing technology, we can come up with new ways of doing it. For example, the study of when did we domesticate dogs? And how is DNA helping us with this? You can do the genotypes of dogs around the world. You can compare fossils across the world. You'll use this DNA to come up with a timeline of where dogs came from, in a sense. I guess at this point, the best thing that comes from a species of wolf that is no longer in existence now. And this was ancestral to the modern made dog. So again, you'll be looking, now you can do DNA. You can do also chemical analysis. So if you grow up in a certain region close to the sea, you'll have certain chemicals in your teeth that won't be there if you grew up in the interior not eating seafood. So you have these new means that can be brought about because of the new knowledge and technologies. Applied anthropology is taking what you know and trying to come up with a practical end. This can mean business. I have 4 minutes left. Why do you think you might need an anthropologist? What if you're Ford?
To know how people live their life so that you can supply them with things that are useful to them.
Exactly. But also you want to know certain things. Are there things in their culture, dress, in their daily lives that might have an impact on which vehicles that they may choose? So what you're trying to do is, and maybe there's a name you shouldn't call a car because in their language it'll be a pile of shit. So thus the cultural anthropology will be trying to say, okay, how can we understand this market in terms of this culture, society, to better sell what we're trying to sell. For example, First Nations communities trying to find evidence for land treaty claims or see what was preserved our culture, trying to bring back, revitalize our culture. So then maybe the applied anthropologist can help look in archives, in what Boaz wrote in his hundreds of pages and bring it back to us so you can work for us because it's useful for us. This is applied engaged anthropology. The Anthropocene, we know that because of the changes, we have changed the environment. So it's the global environment for better or for worse. Even the spread of animals, plants, the shifting of species. We have changed the makeup of our planet based on the movement of species. Sometimes accidentally, nobody wanted to bring rats from continent to continent, but rats did in the 15th, 16th century ships, so they ended up going to every continent. Apart from Alberta, they're still doing their job of keeping the rats out. Modernization, we want to get rid of the church or religion explaining realities. We'll come up with science, philosophy. You have to prove what you're analyzing. Then with the postmoderns, we try to be scientific, but it comes at a cost. We disregard that our perspective, our vision, will is shaping what we see. So therefore, it was a critique. Postmodernism is an awful word. Postmodernism of what? Next class, ask me, and I will explain my critique of Foucault in 30 words or less. Have a great rest of your week.